Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Green Dragon Podcast. I'm your host, Aiden.
Your fellow host Tom.
Your fellow host, Jake.
Guys, me and Jake are live in Atlanta right now. Jake decided to take a trip down to Atlanta, so it's going to be a good day. This is the first live podcast. When was the last live podcast we had? I think it was back
on Christmas at your house, right? Yeah, Christmas. I think Thanksgiving. That was a good podcast too.
Yeah,
the history of Thanksgiving. That was a fun one.
Yeah, I think that one got demonetized too on YouTube. So thanks.
Yeah. We said a bad word, I guess.
Yeah, I think I spoke about something that happened in our society that was related to health. I think I told people to drink for their health, and that really got some people fired up.
Got into the vaccines a little bit, if I remember right, on that podcast, and then also, I'm trying to remember. Oh, it was ivermectin. That's what we were talking about.
Yes.
That was
Yeah.
That was what the forbidden topic that we touched upon. That was what we got canceled for.
Yeah, that was my fault. But oh well, we live and we learn. And today we'll give some more medical advice, but our medical advice should not be taken seriously. We'll speak about drinking today, guys. That's the purpose of this podcast, and I am very excited about this because, what's better than doing a podcast and drinking on it? And this is especially exciting because we're going to be talking about bourbon today. This is going to be, I think this is our 5th episode of the Foundations of Freedom podcast, or like the series that we're doing, Foundations of Freedom. So I'm pretty excited about this one in particular because we're going to talk about bourbon, and we're going to talk about how it's the drink that made America. And I think it's a really interesting topic because whiskey and then, the creation of bourbon has especially played a huge role, integral part of U.S. history. And a lot of times it's just not talked about in the history books, like the pivotal role that whiskey and bourbon have played in U.S. history and the U.S. economy over time. And it's, propped up the economy during hard times. It's paid for our wars. It's not just a drink for Americans, but it's almost a way of life. And it's been a way of life that's kind of been forgotten about and is being revitalized, especially now, like since like 2010. I think bourbon's coming back. For a while it kind of disappeared, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, pretty exciting. If you want like there's 2 really great documentaries you can go watch if you want to learn more after this podcast about bourbon. One is called Neat, and it's on Hulu, I believe. That one's a great documentary. And the other one I really enjoy it is called Straight Up, and it's actually a documentary that all of us have watched, and it's on YouTube, and it's free. So you can't beat that. And Tom, would you agree? It's like for free YouTube documentary, it's a good documentary.
Yeah, and they brought on quite a few high-end people in the bourbon world. Like they had a lot of the owners of the main distilleries. They had people who were in the family, like one of the Beans was on, and yeah, that was pretty impressive. And I liked how they structured it because they told you the history while also telling the story of why it was such a good drink and why America liked it, the Prohibition, how that kind of deterred it, how it funded the wars, and then now how it's getting revitalized. And I liked how they kind of gave us a glimpse also of their culture, like what's behind the bourbon culture, the distilleries. You guys remember that road? It's like a trip where you can go and see a bunch of distilleries.
The Bourbon Trail, right?
The Bourbon Trail, yeah.
Bourbon.
And they had like, I don't know how many, they said over 1 million people now that come to that each year, which is wild. That's huge. Like, that's a ton of people. So Yeah, I really liked it, and I would encourage anyone who would like to learn more about bourbon to check it out. Even if you don't like it, it's a neat history lesson for sure.
No, definitely. I feel like bourbon's coming back. Like I said, I think it disappeared for a while, and we can maybe talk a little bit about why. But yeah, I think they said it was I think, and this was made in 2017, and I know it's gotten even bigger since Bourbon and Whiskey has. So in 2017, I think they said close to 1 million people were visiting every year on the Bourbon Trail, and so you got to think about what that does for the local economy as well, with local businesses, restaurants, and hotels. I mean, it's got to really do wonders. And that's just small area of central Kentucky around the Louisville area. So that's really cool. And I think that it just shows you as you look at the impact I think whiskey and bourbon has had in the US, you start to realize it impacts the farms where the corn and the barley and the rye are grown on. It impacts the jobs of the drivers, the people that make the barrels, the people that work to make other things like the bottles, the labels, everything that goes into making bourbon. It really, I think they said in this documentary, I think they said 16,000 jobs in the central Kentucky area are based around bourbon production, which is really cool. You think about 16,000 people have jobs because of bourbon in central Kentucky. That's pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm. It really is, and it was neat how they have a collaborative structure in their industry. Like they all give each other tips on how to do a better job. And something I really liked was how they all look at it as like an art and a craft. And so it's a neat way, especially for men, I think, to perfect their art to see how good they can get it. And some of the bad behind the scenes of like their distillery, their stills, and like the bottling plants and all that stuff, super high tech. Like one guy said, it's like walking into NASA, the amount of controls they had in there. And it was pretty awesome to see that, like the level of ingenuity that's come into that market. So yeah, it was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it just goes to show you how much craftsmanship goes into. I don't think a lot of people understand the craftsmanship that goes into whiskey and bourbon, and a lot of even when you're talking about other drinks such as like stuff you'd get in a microbrewery, craft beer and stuff like that. There's a lot of work, a lot of honing of the just the science behind the product. And I don't think a lot of people realize what they're drinking is like truly like an art form. So when you buy that bottle off the shelf, you are buying something that's been honed by master distillers for hundreds of years. And their recipes have been passed down and honed to be perfect. And so that's something really cool. Every time you take a sip of bourbon or whiskey, you're taking a sip of history, but bourbon especially. So we're going to talk about, I think first we should probably do some bourbon and whiskey terminology because things do get like a little convoluted. So one of the main things I see is like, okay, what is bourbon and how is it different from other types of whiskey? So bourbon is a whiskey, but for a whiskey to be called a bourbon, it's mash. So what it's made out of, the mixture of grains from which the product is distilled must contain at least 51% corn. And so that is a key factor because there are other types of whiskeys. There's all corn whiskeys. There is rye whiskeys. There's a whole bunch of different mashes which can be, or percentages of mashes which can be used to make different whiskeys. For instance, a corn whiskey has to be made with 80% corn mash. I actually have a bottle right here. This is mellow corn, and so this is, I think it's almost 100% corn mash. It's really good. It's really smooth. It's 100 proof. I mean, As you can see by the bottle, there's not much left in there, so it's pretty easy to drink. But yeah, so you've got corn whiskeys like that, rye. There's 4 main grains that are used to make whiskeys. You've got rye, barley, corn, and wheat. So you've got those 4. So you might hear wheated bourbon. That just means it does still have the 51% corn, but the majority of the rest of the mash is wheat. So it's a high wheated bourbon, and that might play a difference in the flavor profiles. Or like a rye whiskey isn't a bourbon, like this Knob Creek rye here. This is a really good whiskey. But again, it doesn't have the 51% corn. I believe this is a 50, I don't know the exact mash, but I think it's a 52% rye, like 48% corn, or yeah, 48% corn and barley. But with rye whiskeys, you get a little bit different flavor profile. It's typically spicy, like more like cooking spice notes, like allspice and pepper. So that's what differentiates a lot of whiskeys. And so bourbon itself has to be at least 51% corn mash. The mash must be distilled at 160 proof or less, which means that it can never exceed 160 proof at any time. So a lot of other spirits are distilled a bit higher and then watered down to the preferred proof. And then after it's been distilled at 160 proof or less, the distillate that comes off the still must be stored in, and this is the big thing that makes bourbon different. It must be stored in a new charred oak barrel. So it's a charred new oak barrel. So you can never, in bourbon making, you can never use an old barrel. It always has to be a new oak barrel that's been charred. And it comes off, I believe it's stored in the barrels at no more than 125 proof. So it has to go into the barrel at 125 proof. And then it sits in the barrel for really as long as the distillers want it to. It might be 3 years, it might be 5 years, it might be 25 years. It just kind of depends. So that's the distinction. So a lot of people are like, well, is bourbon a whiskey? Yes, it's a whiskey, but other whiskeys aren't bourbon. So bourbon is very particular. It's probably, the rules on bourbon are probably the most strict out of any other whiskey. There's a lot of the Scotches and the Irish whiskeys, they can go into any barrel. I mean, there's less rules. So the people in Kentucky decided to make a lot of rules for their bourbon, and that's where it started.
True connoisseur's drink.
True connoisseur's drink. So when you hear people like talk bad about bourbon, you can hit them with that fact and say the other Scotch sucks because there's less rules. And another thing that is important when talking about bourbon is it cannot be produced outside of the United States. Which means if it's in Canada, it's not bourbon. If it's in Mexico, ain't bourbon. If it's in Scotland, Ireland, doesn't matter where, it's not bourbon if it's not made in the States. So that's pretty cool, and that's something really unique that bourbon is America's drink. And I think that's a really cool thing. So it's very distinctive. Another term you might hear us talk about is bottled in bond, and we'll talk a little bit about bottled in bond. Bottled in bond is a term that relates to American-made distilled beverage that meets the requirements laid out in the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. So this, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but during this era, there was no rules really. So they wanted to come up with an act that made a set of rules that people could guarantee when they see bottled in bond that they knew exactly what they were getting. And so this act dictates that the spirits must be produced at one distilling, be the product of one distilling season. So from, one batch, and one distillery, so it can't be made at multiple distilleries, must be bottled at 100 proof. So when you see bottled in bond, it's always 100 proof. This one here, bottled in bond. This Evan Williams bottled in bond. Also, you'll see it right there in that gold. It's kind of hard to see on the screen, but when you see bottled in bond, that's what it means. So a lot of people believe that bottled in bond takes the rules a step further, and it's the purest form of bourbon. So if you see bottled in bond, that's what it means. Lastly, where does the name bourbon come from? And the origins are a little uncertain on this, but there was a Bourbon County in Kentucky, and a lot of the original barrels of whiskey that started showing up in New Orleans on Bourbon Street in the saloons and the bars had Bourbon County written on the sides of the barrels. So that's kind of how it got started. Give me some of that bourbon whiskey. So pretty cool. But it's originally the Bourbon Street in New Orleans and Bourbon County both took their names from the House of Bourbon, which was a European royal house of French origin. So both of those names were taken from. So if you were French, you might claim that, bourbon comes from them. But, who cares about the French? It's American.
True that. It is pretty cool that we have a true American drink. Like, watching that documentary, I didn't know that bourbon was just a US thing, but now it makes me even more proud of it. Like, in the beginning of that documentary, there was a guy, I think he's either an owner or he's pretty up there in the bourbon world, but he had an Irish lady ask him why Americans weren't in love with their drink as the Irish were in love with their scotch. He said, well, that's a long, long story. But it seems like that love is definitely coming out, which I think is really cool to see in the younger population of America. It's kind of neat to see a patriotic element comes through a drink. I didn't really expect that, but it's a pretty neat unifying factor.
Yeah, it's America's drink. Don't be drinking those queer beers and all this other stuff. I mean, bourbon is America's drink, right? It's the most patriotic. I love it. Yeah, we're going to pour up a drink over here, Tom, because no bourbon podcast would be complete without a drink. So while we pour up our drinks, maybe what do we want to get started with talking about while we start pouring up? Do we want to start with bourbon's early history? Because I think that would help explain a lot of why it became such an integral part of our culture.
I think that would be a great place to start, yeah.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, the original settlers actually, one of the main things that they did one of the things they brought with them over on the ships as they came into North America is they brought stills with them, whiskey stills. So whiskey from the very founding was a very important part of early colonial culture. It was so important because whiskey was vital to society because it did three things. It acted as a way to store excess grain if you farmed. So if you farmed, there was no real good way at the end of the year. If you had excess grain that wasn't being used, there was no way to really preserve it other than to take it, turn it into mash, and distill it. And so it was a good way to store that excess grain. So they turn it into whiskey. And then that whiskey could then be used as medicine, as a drink, or it was often bartered or used as cash before there was currency in the US. So whiskey was like the original method, or one of the main modes of trading actually in the US early on. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, so the early settlers brought over their stills, a lot of them from Ireland and Scotland. They brought over their stills. Fun fact, the actual still, if a family had a still, the firstborn son would actually inherit that still. So it was a very, very important part of the family. And so because it was such an important resource, because it could be used medicinally or as like a form of cash. It was early on in our nation's founding that actually one of the founding fathers, George Washington, decided to get into the whiskey trade, and he actually became the US's first major distiller. And he specialized in rye whiskey, not necessarily like what would be considered bourbon, but rye whiskey, because there wasn't bourbon at this time. But yeah, he was our first president, was also our first major distiller, which I think is pretty cool. And he did it because he saw it as a way. When he was in the Army, every soldier got a ration of whiskey, so he saw it as a good way to create income because it was safe and steady. And I don't know how well that worked for him, because we already talked a little bit on some of our other podcasts that he was kind of like broke and wasn't all that great with money towards the end of his life. So I don't know how good his investment was, but he was our first distiller, which is pretty cool.
That is really cool. That was a fun fact to learn for sure. Seems like the more you learn about early history, the more you're surprised about just all the stuff that the founding fathers really did.
Yeah, it goes to show you how ingrained whiskey is in our culture. That our first president was the first distiller, like that, like first major distiller, like that's cool. I mean, how many other countries get to say that? I mean, it's pretty neat.
Yeah. Do you guys know like what the main drink England has? Like, what do English people drink? Do they drink wine mostly?
Isn't it brandy? Don't they drink a lot of brandy and scotch? Well, I mean, obviously you've got Irish whiskey and scotch, so I know those were big because I even know because early on, obviously, as they immigrated from Ireland and Scotland, they brought their stills. So they were making whiskey, but I think brandy is a big part of it.
Okay, because I think there was something. I think you had it in your Aiden, or it was on the documentary that after the revolutionary times when trade was kind of shrinked from Britain, that's when America started to really produce more of our own like drinks. I think whiskey started to really get it. I guess, yeah. I think. Sorry. Yeah, you were saying that it started to encourage more Americans to distill our own stuff with rye and corn. So I thought that was interesting. It's like maybe that's why we won too. We have stronger whiskey.
Yeah, I think a lot of the scotch in Irish whiskey, I think a lot of it's made with malted barley, and that was like a main grain over there. But as they came to the US, corn is really easy to cultivate here in the US, so I think that's why corn quickly became like one of the main components for making our whiskey here. Because it was just the grain they had left over at the end of the year. It was just there. So compared to the others. But the original trade route is kind of interesting of bourbon, and this is kind of what puts bourbon on the map. This is kind of the inception of bourbon, because the farmers started making their whiskey, and they started shipping it in barrels down the Mississippi River, and it would end up, they would float on, or the Mississippi and the Ohio. So in Kentucky, in Louisville, they would, go onto the Ohio River and eventually float onto the Mississippi and then float all the way down to New Orleans. And so along the way, by the time it got to New Orleans, they would, sell their whiskey in New Orleans, and they would sell it on Bourbon Street. And then they would ride the ferry boats, like it was like a 3-month journey back up the Mississippi, and they would kind of do it all over again. So this kind of started a trade route up and down the Mississippi for whiskey. And it's actually where whiskey first started getting put into barrels and aged in barrels, because it took so long to get down the river. The whiskey, the distillate that they had, would have to be aged, because they wouldn't get there in 2 days. It like took several months. So as the whiskey started aging in these barrels, that's where a lot of the flavor came from. People really liked the taste of it, and so it quickly caught on, especially in New Orleans. And they started serving it on the bars on the river boats, and people would ask, can I get some of that whiskey from Bourbon County, because the barrels would have Bourbon County on them. So they quickly got shortened to bourbon, and that's where the name bourbon comes from. So I think it's pretty neat that it kind of paved the way for this trade route up and down the Mississippi River in many ways. And it really, I think they talked about it a little bit, but it really, the whiskey trade up and down the Mississippi and the Ohio, a lot of the towns like Louisville, New Orleans, they really owe a lot of their history and a lot of their success off the whiskey trade, because the main way of shipping whiskey was up and down the river.
Yeah, it was really interesting how it became like almost like the main form of cash in that early time, especially for farmers. And that trade route really grew. And I don't know if it led to, but I know that the steamboats had a huge influence on that, because once those came along, then the bourbon industry really started to move up. Because they were saying, like, on the trade route, they build flatboats, put the barrels on them, go down, be fighting Indians and bandits on the way down. Then they had to come back up the trail, and they usually had a horse so they could outrun the bandits. But it was a pretty extensive process. So like whiskey was pretty special at that time. And then once the steamboats came along, then it started to get a lot bigger because people could get it faster and easier.
Yeah, and then whiskey trade, really, I think it sparked in many ways the need for the steamboat and the usage of the steamboat up and down the river. It gave a reason for there to be it gave the need for the steamboat, which then got used for many other things. So I think it really propelled the usage of steamboats in trade up and down the rivers very, very quickly.
Yeah, and that was pretty wild just to think about how, they just were floating stuff down the river and had to fight off any unwanted people who were trying to take it. And yeah, it was pretty cool how that kind of made the whole industry emerge. And then to hear how it became like the main form of taxes to run the country, which is wild. I had no idea that was true. But it's pretty interesting to see that it was that big that it actually ran the government on most of it, for all the wars until, well, it helped with the world wars too. So it's pretty wild that one drink could do all of that, because I wouldn't think that just looking at the industry now, but learning the history, I'm like, wow, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Like you said, it was the original tax. There was no income tax back then, so whenever there was a need to raise money by the government, they're like, "Oh, let's throw out a whiskey tax. That'll give us a little extra income." We'll talk about the Whiskey Rebellion, because that's involved in the whiskey tax. But first, Tom, you mentioned that early on we switched over to native grains like rye and corn to make spirits. And it was because I got the note here in 1776, so right when America was getting its start, the war with the British hindered the sugar trade, and sugar was used to make rum. And so that's why they resorted to distilling from native grains such as rye and corn instead of the sugar. So there you go. But in 1794, there was something that happened called the Whiskey Rebellion. Like we said, the first tax ever levied in the new colonies was actually a whiskey tax on the farmers who were selling their spirits. And the farmers got pissed because they'd been selling their spirits and there was no tax. But then all of a sudden, these Western Pennsylvanians farmers didn't want to pay their whiskey tax for the war. It was the first tax, like I said, for a domestic product from the new government. And so George Washington had to send his armies down to suppress the revolting farmers from taking over. But like Tom mentioned, the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and almost all, through the both world wars, most of the funds needed were raised by a whiskey tax because there was no income tax to support the military. So whenever there was a war effort, they would always have a whiskey tax or increase the whiskey tax in order to pay for their war effort. So it's pretty, like, early on, it becomes a very staple. It becomes a staple part of the American government too, unfortunately.
Well, I don't know if you guys have seen this shirt. I think we might have to make this shirt, but it says drinking booze and refusing to lose since 1776. And that's so accurate because literally, like, the whole whiskey market is what enabled us to pay for the wars. Just still mind-boggling to think about, because normally you think of like how much money goes into war, and I think it all came from pretty much one drink. It's just insane. Like, why did we have to get an income and sales tax if we only needed more whiskey?
Exactly. Hey, I'll take a whiskey tax over my income tax, right? Like, yeah. And I think part of the problem is probably less people stopped drinking as much whiskey, and then it became less the population percentage. So it probably became less, economically feasible to support our entire nation off of the whiskey.
Yeah, true.
But in 1802, our buddy Thomas Jefferson, he actually really hated whiskey. He was kind of a loser. He liked French wines. Boo. But he decided he was gonna eliminate the hated whiskey tax. And so he got rid of it. So, I mean, good on him for that, but also, he kind of sucks because he doesn't like whiskey. So I don't know who you vote for, really root for there. Do you root for George and his distilling company, or do you root for Thomas and his removal of the whiskey tax? I don't know. Another important date early on for whiskey, and this is where I think, again, bourbon would not be where it is today without this, possibly. In 1807, two brothers from the south of Cognac, France, actually settle along the Mississippi River. And just like we talked about a little bit ago, that route up and down the Mississippi River is extremely important for bourbon. And we talked about how they shipped the barrels of whiskey up and down the Mississippi. Well, it wasn't until 1807 that they did that. And in 1807, these two brothers from Cognac, France, brought their tradition of aging spirits, that's what cognac is, in charred barrels to whiskey. And so as the whiskey came down the river, they would put it in these charred barrels, and it would age in the charred barrels as it was shipped down the Mississippi. So that's where this idea of charred barrels comes from, which imparts a lot of the flavors that are in bourbon today. All bourbon is aged in new oak charred barrels, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of I heard Jordan Peterson talk about this, and he said that new art forms are created when there's different parameters set on a trade or a industry. So he was saying like you see a different form of communication based on different social media channels. Like YouTube is long form, Twitter is like short text, Instagram is photo. So he said it enables you to communicate messages differently. And so with the bourbon industry, it's almost like they're communicating the different tastes of a specific and particular style of drink. And it's like these are the parameters, and then all these distilleries are going to try to see what's the best they can do inside those parameters. But it's really neat because it's, in one way, it's kind of like how far can you go in a certain direction, and if you can keep going in that direction, how good can you get it? And it's pretty neat to see how there were little innovations along the way with bourbon, and it was such a big hit that they wanted to make sure it was really good bourbon, and then that's when they decided to make it more regulated. And it was interesting watching the documentary because it seemed like the distillery owners, and I guess we call them distributors, they didn't seem that offended by the regulation. Like they almost were like, "Yeah, this is okay." I was surprised to hear that because they said, I don't know how much it was. Was it like 70% of the price of bourbon is just taxes or something like that?
I believe it was close to 70. Yeah.
Which is wild to think, like, because you think how much time goes into making one bottle of whiskey, like making it, distilling it, bottling it, or aging it, bottling it, and then distributing it, and then selling it at a profit, and paying all the taxes. That's actually pretty cheap considering all the stuff that goes on. So it's pretty amazing that they made a craft where you can pretty much buy it for decent, it's not horribly expensive, and it covers all those costs and it has such a high tax on it. So it's just pretty interesting to learn about it all.
Yeah, it's really amazing, like how single-handedly whiskey and bourbon was able to, I think, support a lot of our nation's projects too. I mean, that tax, I know 70% is a lot, but you look at, the wars it funded, the things it built for so long, and that's really impressive. So then if you start to look at American history and you say, well, it did this, we supported this through whiskey, the whiskey tax, and we supported this through the whiskey tax, and this and this and this. You start to realize that America probably wouldn't be the same America without the whiskey tax. Like, it's crazy. Like, as much as, you hate to see a tax on something as good as whiskey, it's amazing that much of American culture and history was built off this whiskey tax and built off, kind of the foundation of whiskey.
Oh, for sure. Like, if there wasn't this, just think of all the other industries that probably would have been hit and caused a lot more chaos. But somehow, like, it seemed like the bourbon manufacturers were tough-skinned. Like, it didn't seem like much phased them, especially when you get closer to like the turn of the century, when the Prohibition comes around, and they put a kibosh on it all. And they were saying like that was the time of the Industrial Revolution, so you had pretty much every factory, and they said like 4 saloons right next to it. So you would go to the factory, go to the saloon, and the food was free, and you only had to do was pay for your whiskey. That was crazy that it could pay for all the food too, because food was a lot more expensive back then.
Yeah. Yeah, and people got upset about it because people were like, well, it was said that the common man that worked in these factories would spend all his money that he made in the factory on whiskey and gambling. Whiskey and gambling. So we had a bunch of degenerates.
Yeah. I know, that was really funny.
Could you imagine could you imagine if the majority of our population today were like degenerate drinkers and gamblers?
Well,
I mean, we're not far off.
Yeah. I think that might be better in some cases.
I think
rather
you're
than
right.
having a Bud Light problem.
Yeah. Bud Light, queer beer.
Yeah. Weirdos.
Too funny. Too funny. We'll talk about Prohibition in a second because I want to get there. But 1865, important because we just got done talking about the Civil War in some of our other podcasts. In the Civil War, obviously, we used the whiskey tax to fund the war, but also it was used. They said most soldiers were given a pint of whiskey a day as a local anesthetic, pain reliever. Others were given as much whiskey as they could take. So there was a lot of heavy drinkers that probably came out of the Civil War and relied heavily on whiskey. So it just goes to show you at the time medically how important whiskey actually was. Like, we're not just joking around when we say it was used medicinally. Like, it was used medicinally. I mean, they gave them a pint a day. Geez, like, I don't even know if most people today drink that much water.
Yeah, that's an incredible amount. Considering how many soldiers there were, that's a lot of whiskey.
It's a lot of whiskey, and all that tax money was going to fund that war. Abraham Lincoln, baby, he was rolling out them whiskey taxes. Pay for the cannons.
Yeah. Wow, that's wild. It was interesting how they said like the whiskey was used to clean wounds and it was like the main sterilizing agent. It was also a way for the soldiers to have some sort of drink besides just what they could find in water. So it was interesting how many uses it had. I was wondering actually when we were doing our podcast what the medical procedures looked like for trying to keeping things clean, but but pretty crazy how much it does. Like when you start looking more and more into whiskey, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and too, like you said, water. I mean, you got to think in many cases it was probably safer to drink whiskey than it was to drink water, just because the whiskey is a distilled spirit, so it removes a lot of those bacteria, it kills bacteria. So it's probably safer to drink your whiskey because it wasn't like they had purified water. They weren't running around with water purifiers out on the battlefield. So you got to think whiskey in a lot of cases back then in general was just probably safer to drink than water.
Yeah, I mean I know that's the case with like beer in Europe. That was definitely like wine and beer were the safe drinks because it was purified in a way. So yeah, whiskey became that drink in America. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about. So we talked about the Bottled and Bond Act. That would be the next kind of like timeline point. Obviously, so one of the major issues going on at the turn of the century was all this whiskey. There was high demand for whiskey, right? You've got soldiers drinking pints of whiskey a day on the battlefield coming out of the Civil War. Whiskey's in high demand. So one of the problems that comes with that is there was no rules to whiskey. You could, distill, have a distillate and then add a bunch of flavorings and food colorings. And it got to a point where it was actually getting really dangerous because people were bottling it up and saying it was one thing, and it was literally just like flavored and colored water or colored distillate. And so people were getting frustrated because they were spending their money on quote whiskey and it wasn't actually whiskey. So that's where the Bottled and Bond Act comes in. Bottled and Bond Act establishes, proper labeling and rules to ensure that when somebody bought a bottle of whiskey, they knew exactly what they were getting. So that's the Bottled and Bond Act. Still, to this day, one of the greatest things that's ever happened for whiskey because it kind of created a uniform process. Not always used, but at least it created some uniformity and some structure to what is whiskey and what is not whiskey. So I think that's a really important date in history. But now we can talk about the Volstead Act, which is better known as Prohibition. Nobody likes this one. No, I can't name one person that liked Prohibition other than maybe the people that were also. It's funny because the people that wanted to start Prohibition and started Prohibition were actually the same people that ran the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement. They were just like, okay, I get it on both of those, but really had to be a party pooper on the whiskey. Like, come on, kind of sucks.
Yeah. Seems like whiskey has gone through some crazy times. Just learning about the history more, I'm just like, wow, how did it survive? It was hit on all sides, especially the Prohibition, where it said it was like 15 years of no legal production except 4 distilleries, one of which was for Buffalo Trace. And they're all, I think 3 out of 4 were in Louisville, right? We're in Kentucky.
Yeah, I believe it was, and I could be completely wrong on this, but I think 2 of the others were Four Roses, I believe was also Four Roses, and I believe Old Forester or Brown Foreman continued. They actually, as we speak about Prohibition, this is what I'm sipping on currently. This is Old Forester. I'm going to plug these bourbons as we go, and maybe we'll get a sponsorship. This is Old Forester Prohibition style whiskey, 1920. So this is good stuff. So during Prohibition, here we go. Old Forester was bottled as medicinal whiskey at 117 West Main Street under Kentucky Permit Number 3. The typical barrel proof at that time was 115 proof. This is 115 proof whiskey, so they made it in the style of Prohibition. The Prohibition whiskey made that. They actually got a great lineup. They've got a whole whiskey row, and they've got 4 different whiskeys. They've got Bottled and Bond. They've got this one. They've got a 1910 that's based off, I think, their original mash. So if you want to check out, this is like super underrated whiskey. This whiskey drinks like $100 bottle. I think it's like $50 bucks, $60. You can't beat this bottle. But that's what I'm drinking right now. So Prohibition whiskey. So you had Old Forester, you had Buffalo Trace, you had Four Roses, and I don't know the 4th. I'm blanking on the 4th. But yeah, you went from the boom of bourbon, and then all of a sudden, I think they said, 18 or 17 distilleries shut down in like one day in Kentucky alone. And you think about all the jobs that were lost because of that. It was the people making the bottles, the people making the labels, the cooperages making the barrels, the people transporting the barrels, everybody, all these people that worked on the river, people that worked in the distillery, all these people lost their job very quickly. And so it was a big deal. This Prohibition kind of sucked, and nobody really liked it except for, like we said, the people that put it into place. But what's very interesting, Prohibition was kind of like, there was a lot of states that were already dry, and actually in Kentucky, most of the counties in Kentucky at that time were dry counties, which means they didn't serve alcohol. So like which is crazy because bourbon originates from, kind of the central part of Kentucky, Louisville, and yet most of the counties in Kentucky were dry at the time of Prohibition already. They had been dry for some time because I think mostly religious views.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's interesting too how they said it wasn't illegal to drink, but it was illegal to bake. So then that's when the speakeasies came up with the secret passwords and the secret who knows who, and then that rose to the government starting to be aware that I think at the beginning of Prohibition there were 16 million barrels of whiskey in reserve, and by the end there was only 17 million, and that's when they were like, well, maybe we should start bringing back whiskey because I think that was during World War One, right? Or was that World War Two? That was World War Two, wasn't it?
I believe it was World War II, yeah.
Because then they decided that it'd be better to have the tax money from it and to bring it back at more full steam. It wasn't full steam because I think there's still a few restrictions on it, weren't there? You had to get like a legal permit and all that stuff.
Yes, I believe so. I think in World War II, well, the repeal was in 1993, or not 93, 1933. Franklin Roosevelt brings back whiskey to the industry, but he maximizes the tax I believe it was during the Great Depression. So it's kind of that lull. So he brings it back because they needed the revenue through the Great Depression. Then in the 41 for World War II, U.S. government assumes control of the industry, basically took over the distilleries, because they needed to churn out, I think the metric was 1.7 billion gallons of industrial alcohol to be used in the war to create synthetics such as smokeless gunpowder, neoprene rubber, and other things that we're using in the war effort. So they basically took over the distilleries then again to fuel the war. So there was kind of a hiatus there a little bit.
Yeah. I was still a little mind-boggling how much that industry really does. And considering how many barriers of entry there are to get into it, yet there's still so many good distillers that make really good whiskey.
Absolutely. And, even look at recent times. We won't say the name, but something 19 happened back in 2020. The vid, the China virus, that'll probably get flagged. But anyways, that happened, and immediately one of the things you saw is distilleries and places that made spirits. Immediately, production went to hand sanitizers. So a lot of places that made tequila, if you got hand sanitizer that smelled like tequila or whiskey, it was probably because it was made in a place that made tequila or whiskey, right? So it's amazing how much, whenever there's something going on, that industry really picks up and steps in and kind of takes over a little bit.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see, like, in World War II, it was kind of like running the war again, and then then after World War II, you have Truman to conserve grain and send it over to help Europeans, and then we have kind of like a move towards other liqueurs because kids didn't really want to drink what their parents drank, which was whiskey. They didn't want to feel old. And then you had them whiskey kind of got out of culture. people started to go to tequila, light beers, vodka, easy drinking stuff. Not made for real men. Uncles don't drink that stuff. And then you have kind of a resurgence later on. You had different slogans that different distilleries came up with to help boost and promote the brand or the industry as a whole. And then you have in 1964 when Congress declares bourbon as a distinctive product of the United States. I think that was huge because then that was like you made an artificial scarcity because only Americans can make it. Therefore, you just opened up a huge export ability because now everyone who wants to buy true, authentic bourbon needs to buy it from the US.
Exactly. And I think that was an important step because, like you said, Tom, you had the world wars that happened. And, you know, at that point, whiskey is kind of going through its first real rough patch. You've got the Prohibition ends, and then, you know, World War II happens, and they're like, okay, we got to take over the distilleries. So then they take over the distilleries, and then they're like, oh, wait. We got to use that grain that we're using to make whiskey, and we got to send it overseas to feed, you know, the people that have been the war-torn kind of nation of Europe, like, you know, nation as a whole of Europe, all the different countries in Europe that have just been kind of obliterated, and they need to have some grain, so we send that overseas. And then all of a sudden, you know, they bring whiskey back, but it kind of falls out of the spotlight. And these, like you said, whiskey and bourbon become a thing that old people drink. And so this new generation wants their new fun thing. And this is kind of the turning point, I think, in American, if you're looking at spirits as just, you know, consumer patterns, this is where the turn is. So, you know, it shifts to vodkas and gins, you know, the white distilled spirits, tequilas, and all that kind of gets, you know, bourbon kind of gets, and whiskey get pushed to the back burner. Then you get, you know, through the 60s and 80s, it kind of continues, right? And there's a lot of marketing towards bourbon, and bourbon does this weird thing. The industry realizes it's kind of in trouble. The distilleries are like, well, we need to appeal to this younger generation that doesn't want to drink our product that we were making for so long. So, you know, for so long, the Bottled and Bond Act was huge. And most whiskeys were about 100 proof. Well, all of a sudden, everybody's drinking like 80 proof vodka with no flavor. So they're like, well, we need to switch this up. So they proof down their distillate and they market it as a lighter drink. And so the new like proof point goes from 100 proof down to 86 proof. So it's this very light drink. So to this day, you'll still see in a lot of bourbons, you know, all the bourbons I have behind me are higher proof because I like more density of flavor. But if you look at a lot of like the bottom shelf offerings that, like, say Old Forester has an 86 proof, and that's their bottom line. Wild Turkey has an 86 proof. That's their bottom line. So to this day, those are still kind of the bottom shelf bourbons. And that was really, there was no such thing as like low proof bourbons and low proof whiskeys back then. It was all 100 proof pretty much. So it was at this point in history when the American consumer's taste changed that bourbon kind of shifted and became something it really wasn't, because the beauty of bourbon is that rich, delightful flavor that you get from it. And so it kind of shifted its brand persona as a whole and became something a little off brand for a while.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could get your take on this, Jake. But like, I don't know if you guys have noticed a pattern here. Whenever America's fought big wars and battles, and that's when we have American great points in history, we're all drinking whiskey. And in the points where we're not so proud of our history, it's illegal. We can't drink it. Things are going bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, where are we at right now?
That's what I was trying to think. It's like we're getting there. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's like I feel like with the resurgence of whiskey, that's actually making me really hopeful because I'm thinking, this is the next generation of true Americans coming up right now. This is when good old American boys and American women start to realize, yeah, we're like the top dogs, and top dogs drink bourbon and they have a good old time, and we don't take nothing from nobody.
I think you're right on. I think right now is interesting because I think they're split, right? So you've got the resurgence of bourbon. Bourbon's huge in the last, whiskeys in general, huge in the last 6 years. But then you've got the other side of the coin. You've got the beer industry with all this queer beer stuff. And, you're just starting to realize, like, I think right now is interesting because it is split, very much split down the middle. But it is very hopeful, like you said, Tom, that there is this love of a spirit that is truly American and very, very bold. That's kind of what bourbon, when I think of bourbon, I think bold flavors, bold people, willing to take chances. You think about these guys that floated down the Mississippi, were willing to take their chances with the Indians. Think about the cowboys out west and drinking their whiskey as they fight off the Indians, as they, pan for gold and all these different things. You think about all these bold people, the saloons out west, the saloons that created Prohibition because they were causing too much gambling and degeneracy. I mean, it's a good thing to see it come back a little bit because you kind of, here's my take on this. You kind of need you don't need complete degenerates in society, but you need people that are degenerate enough to take risks, to have the balls to step up and do something great, right? And I think that's kind of the story that bourbon tells, is it's people that are bold and willing to take a chance on something and not afraid to get their hands dirty.
Well, it's actually really funny that you mentioned that because I think back in our other podcasts that we had a little trouble with, we were talking about how beer actually stops testosterone production and promotes estrogen production. So it's demasculine. Like, it takes away your masculinity.
Hence queer beer.
Yeah. So there's a real problem here. So how do we fix it? You go to bourbon. You stick with the good stuff. You be a man. You take your liquor, the good old stuff that, like they say, put hair on your chest, knock your socks off, and then things will be okay.
Yeah. Let me tell you, there is a point where it becomes too much. But in general, back in like the late 1800s, man, these guys were they said the average American drank a fifth. So one of these a week. That's men and women. They were slamming the booze. I mean, just slamming the bourbon. I mean, it was crazy. So consumption was obviously way higher. But, that might be a little too much. But there is something to be said for it. There are some anecdotal health benefits. I don't want to get too much into that because we'll probably get demonetized. But there are some things that point to the tannins that you get out of the barrel being advantageous, and also the antimicrobial, antibacterial properties. That might be good. So in moderation, always good. I will say this, and this might make me a pussy. I don't know. Actually, no, it was for Lent, so not really. I gave up bourbon and all hard spirits for the last 50 odd days, 60 odd days, and I had my first drink again on Easter. But I will say there is some merit to taking a break for a little bit if you have a problem. I may have had a problem for a little bit. I'm not afraid to put that out there. I was drinking a lot of bourbon, and I think that made me a better American, drinking that much bourbon for a while. But it was good to take a slight break and come back and then realize how much I love it and how much I appreciate it. So
Yeah.
I do want to mention, if you feel like you're drinking too much and it's causing issues, take a step back, do a 40-day challenge, do a 40-day cleanse, drink some wine instead. I had wine instead, and in minimal amounts, and it was good. So just want to put that out there. We're not encouraging complete degeneracy. Just slight, ever so slight, and it's a beautiful balance. You need to be a slight degenerate in everything. Everything you do in life, you should have slight degeneracy. Because why? Because with degeneracy, it means you're putting effort into it, whether that's drinking or starting a business. So you need to be a little bit degenerate in everything.
Yeah, I have to think about that one. But I definitely...
That might be the liquor speaking. I'm not sure.
But yeah, definitely think about your choices always, and be responsible for sure. I hope the audience caught this. This was a bit of satire. So
absolutely.
We're just making correlations based upon surface level data that's not very advanced at all. So we're just pointing things out from patterns we see here in our history lesson. But
yeah, my analysis of this is probably the equivalent of like a gerbil. If a gerbil took a in-depth analysis on this, so take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, but I think you might be onto something there, actually, Aiden, because Jordan Peterson talks a lot about the balance between chaos and order, and like how chaos allows for a new type of order. So you might be onto something there. Like maybe you do need to be a little bit wild in order to have a better future. I mean, that does play along with like the idea of the three types of men: the good dangerous man, the bad dangerous man, and the weak man. We know the weak man can't take alcohol. We know that the bad dangerous man goes wild and really bad when he drinks alcohol. But the good dangerous man, he can own it, and then he can use it to fuel the flame for a better future.
Yeah, I think it's just understanding. I think anything you look at any successful person, right? And they're typically very passionate and almost very addicted to what they do. And that's something, like when I say degeneracy, that's kind of what I mean. You have to be a little bit addicted to whatever your passion is in life. And so whether that's, making bourbon or doing your job or providing for your family, whatever it is, your business, you have to be a little bit crazy, a little bit passionate. Not degenerate, but passionate. You have to bring that passion in if you want to be successful.
Yeah, you definitely see that with like after we got bourbon as being distinctly American, you had the Beams start to really promote bourbon again, and then you have like Maker's Mark, and then you have Buffalo Trace coming out with Blanton's and a few other things that then brought us to the present day of 2010s, where bourbon starts to skyrocket. But I mean, those were all examples of people just kind of going out on a ledge to see what would bring attention to the market, and it worked. And I think there's definitely something there with if you look at younger people today, like the faith is actually really sprouting up again in young Americans. Like I just heard this guy, I find this guy's really cool. One of my friends, she was saying that for the Easter Vigil, there were lines out of the church at 3 p.m. to make it in there, and like all the masses on the 5 masses they had were packed. So I think something's going on here. I think we're onto something with these patterns, because it seems like when you go for something real, it's usually thick and it's strong and it's powerful. And I think bourbon is the exemplar of that in the drink world.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say I appreciate your guys' analysis of this. I'm not nearly as well versed as you two in my bourbon and whiskey knowledge, so this was very informative for me. I did want to say, Tom, you just commented on our generation, and Aiden mentioned a couple minutes back about men and women in the late 1800s, early 1900s that were putting back bottles and bottles of whiskey on the daily, weekly. So it just made me curious, and I don't know if you guys would know this off the top of your heads, but like alcohol tolerance. I was curious if that's gone down over the past century, down to our generation, because the way I thought about it was these people 100, 200 years ago, they were still getting up, going to work every day after this. So it's like, and now we have people our generation that are getting drunk off of 2 or 3 White Claws, So I don't know. I'd be curious to see some stats, and maybe it'll be like maybe I'll do some research this week on it, but like the level of alcohol tolerance, I feel like given the comparison of of men and women 100, 200 years ago and the average college student now, I feel like it's wearing a little bit thin, maybe.
I think you're onto something here, Jake, because I'm just looking, I'm trying to pull a Jamie here from Joe Rogan, trying to look up something, but it looks like we're not as strong as we used to be, just from my initial glances.
I'll provide my anecdotal evidence here.
Okay.
So let's just say 4 months ago, I was having a significant, compared to now, significant amount of bourbon. Meaning, let's just say per week, and this is, again, please don't take this as health advice. This is not good health advice. I had to stop because my blood pressure got high. Actually, no, I just stopped because it wasn't good for my weight either. I'm drinking like probably per week 10 glasses of bourbon, so 1 or more a night. My alcohol tolerance through the roof. You give me a bottle of wine, didn't do nothing to me. Now I'll say this is my first time really drinking bourbon in a while. I'm enjoying life. I'm by no means gone, but like this would have been like, let's put it this way. 3 drinks tonight has gotten me as buzzed as 6 or 7 drinks 4 months ago. So I can tell you from drinking bourbon every day, it makes a big difference. And we're getting soft because we're drinking queer beer that's light, and we're drinking White Claws. I mean, that's my input. It could be completely scientifically debased and stupid, but I think I'm on to something here.
I would like to see like a statistic and report to see how does that all work, like alcohol tolerance, because I think what it normally is like if you slow your metabolism down, then you can handle more alcohol. But sometimes if you have a really high metabolism, you process it so quickly it doesn't really affect you.
Well, I'll say this, my metabolism was much lower a few months ago, so I don't know. Yeah, I couldn't tell you actually.
No.
I feel like it could go both ways. I think it's dependent on the person too. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, in school, like I could have 2 beers and not feel like I had anything. It was like drinking water.
Yeah. No,
And
I'm very similar in that regard. It takes me, if it's a light beverage, like 8% alcohol, I need to feel a buzz. If it's like a light beer, it takes like 6 or 7 beers before I get a buzz. So it's just not even worth it, because then it's just excess calories. And that's what I found. That's what you learn after not drinking for it. It's just excess calories. It's like, it's not even fun. Like, I mean, that's why I like whiskey, because you can enjoy the flavor of whiskey, but like light beer, pointless. It's just water basically with a little bit of alcohol in it and calories. So why drink it?
Yeah.
Again, I'm going to say this again, queer beer. That will be the clip from this podcast.
Yeah, we'll just have to have a clip of you, Aiden, be like, queer beer. Don't do it. Just don't do it. It's like, we'll start out. Okay, guys, this is a perfect opportunity. We're going to come out with our new marketing phrases. So to hit Bud Light and Nike at the same time, we're going to come out with one that says, queer beer, just don't do it.
Too funny. We're slowly, the more drinks in, I think, the more sips of whiskey, we're slowly degrading this podcast.
I think we are.
So we're gonna finish our timeline here. So let's just say 2017. Within the last few years, I think this was the last time it was done. There are 1,300 craft distilleries. That is something that's absolutely amazing. Not something that's been seen in the past. So that is amazing to have 1,300 craft distilleries in this country today that are making bourbon. So really cool. That's not the big distillers, that's the small ones. Me and Jake are going to go tomorrow to a craft distillery in Atlanta, in Buckhead, called ASW Distillery. We'll do a tour. It's going to be really cool. So that's just a smaller version of these big guys like Jim Beam and Buffalo Trace. So really kind of a neat thing to see the rise in craft distilleries. And I think it just is a testament to the American people getting behind their drink. So that's really cool. Before we completely lose track here, I would like to plug our new apparel launch, because this is very important. You guys, right now, it's live. So you need to go to lifelineusa.store. And you might have already seen this. If you were a dedicated fan to this podcast, you would have seen this a week ago, because when this is coming out, it's a week after I've uploaded all these things to the website. So for you lovely people that are dedicated fans, you would have already seen this and bought a shirt or bought a tumbler. For those of you who are not, don't worry, you're not missing out quite yet. We've got a bunch of designs up on lifelineusa.store. We've got Bourbon is My Spirit Animal t-shirt. I'm going to pull these up just so you guys can see them if you're watching. We've got Bourbon is My Spirit Animal. This is a men's classic fit t-shirt. It says bourbon and it says is my spirit animal in small print. We've got This Girl Needs Whiskey t-shirts, graphic t-shirts. We've got Bourbon is always a good idea, because it is. Whiskey is always a good idea, because it is. Thought we'd just, have some differentiation there. We've got another version of the Bourbon is My Spirit Animal. These are awesome t-shirts, guys. Really soft fabric. Fantastic. They've got our Born Patriotic American flag on the sleeve so you can rep. Bourbon fixes everything because it actually does. It's a proven fact. The only thing it might not fix is your marriage. Don't think it would help there. Bourbon is made for real Americans because, as we've discussed in this podcast, only real Americans drink bourbon. So, guys, bunch of these. Again, we've got the shirts, we've got hoodies, and then we've got these tumblers, and these are my favorite. So we've got, bourbon is always a good idea. Whiskey is always a good idea. This girl needs whiskey. Bourbon fixes everything. Bourbon is my spirit animal. Bourbon is made for real Americans, all on your tumbler, because guess what? It's summer, boys. It's summer. And do you know what happens during summer? It gets hot outside, especially in Atlanta. That's why they call it Hot Atlanta. And so this summer, I will be drinking my iced whiskey or neat whiskey. Doesn't matter. You can do it both. Keeps your whiskey from getting too hot in the sun. You can get these stainless steel tumblers and keep your whiskey chilled with a cool design. So if you're interested, go to lifelineusa.store, and they are live as we speak. So just wanted to plug that real quick. And then if you want other cool whiskey t-shirts, Grunt Style, another American cool brand. I'm wearing one right now. Whiskey helps, because it does. It's a proven fact. Again, this is not medical advice. YouTube, please don't monetize us. Or strike us, for that matter. You can go check them out too at gruntstyle.com. They've got awesome stuff. You should check out them because they're another American brand. We like to support American brands. So with that, guys, anything else that we want to talk about before we exit this whiskey podcast and continue with the degeneracy?
I don't know. I feel like we covered a pretty good portion of it. I would highly recommend the straight up American bourbon documentary on YouTube for people. That was just a really fun watch and learned a lot of really neat history. It kind of took you back into a lot of the culture of America. Just neat to see. I don't know about you guys, but it makes me feel like more at home when I see history of America. So that, and I mean, I don't know necessarily what it's like in different parts of the country, but it seems like from that video at least, like these distilleries are a great place to connect with people and almost make like a business networking event there, because like it almost looks like conventions almost. So I don't know, just thought I'd shout that out for people who want to learn more. And yeah, I'll let you take over, Aiden.
Yeah, like Tom said, I would highly recommend, like I said, 1,300 craft distilleries. Go find, just search online, distillery near me. I did it. I didn't even realize there's, 4 within a short area of me. One doesn't even make whiskey. They just make moonshine. It's awesome. They've been making moonshine for the last 100 years, and they only use corn from local farms. It's pretty cool. It's called if you're in the Georgia area, it's called Dawsonville Distillery. Pretty cool thing. Another one, if you're in the Georgia area, this is a bottle of 13th Colony whiskey. Really hit hard on the market recently with their double oaked. Their double oaked was basically whiskey of the year this past year. This one is their Southern style whiskey. They have a rye whiskey. You can find them if you have Total Wines around you. You can find them at Total Wine. Recommend checking them out. I mean, just look in your area. Most big cities are going to have several distilleries, and I would just recommend going, visiting, touring, tasting, and then just talking. And I think you can learn a lot, not only about whiskey, but just about people. And you can really connect and engage with people. So that's the beauty of spirits. That's the beauty of whiskey. I think we'll end it with this toast Now, disclaimer, this toast here, I've been experimenting with ChatGPT. And ChatGPT wrote a toast better than I could write a toast, which is impressive. So, guys, let's get out our glasses here. I'm going to pour myself a little bit more of this Weller Special Reserve here. We got to get our glasses out for this beautiful toast. So, a toast from ChatGPT to bourbon. Here's to bourbon, a drink that's more than just a spirit. It's a symbol of American history and the culture we inherit. From the earliest settlers who brought whiskey-making craft to the farmers who grew the grains and the distillers who raised the bar, bourbon has been an integral part of our nation's story, a drink that's been enjoyed by folks of every rank and glory. From presidents to cowboys to soldiers in the war, bourbon has been a loyal companion and reminder of who we are. Its impact on American history is hard to overstate. From the taxes it helped fund the Revolutionary War to the jobs that it creates. It's a symbol of our heritage and spirit of the land. It's a drink that's brought us together and helped us take a stand. So let's raise our glass to bourbon and the impact it has made. May it continue to be a part of our history and the traditions that won't fade. Cheers to bourbon, a drink that's more than just a spirit, a symbol of America, and the story that we inherit. Cheers.
Cheers.
With that, guys, hopefully you're cheersing with us. If not, get home, drive safe, and then have a nice glass of bourbon. We appreciate you listening to this podcast, and we'll catch you next week. Be safe. Be smart. Drive safe. Don't drink and drive. Most importantly, be a good American. Peace.